Hi, welcome to Beyond Belief Sobriety. This is a podcast and community for people who are seeking or who have found a secular path to recovery from addictions of all kinds. We've been podcasting about secular recovery options since September of 2015, and as of today, there are some 286 episodes posted here on our YouTube channel, on our website, beyondbeliefsobriety.com, and found anywhere you like to download your podcast. In addition to the podcast episodes, we also live stream every Saturday at 12 o'clock noon Eastern. So please join us if you're interested in checking that out. If you like what you see on our YouTube channel, please click the subscribe button and you'll always know what's going on here. Well, today we're going to be speaking with Ted Perkins. He is the author of a new book, Addicted in Film, Movies We Love About the Habits We Hate. Ted's uniquely qualified to write this book. Not only is he a person in long-term recovery, but he has many years of experience in television and film production. The book is great. I would highly recommend it. I enjoyed it thoroughly as I was reading it. It's more than just an accounting of movies about addiction and recovery. It tells the story of addiction and recovery through these films. And it's a book that you read and maybe you've seen these films and you learn something more about them, or you haven't seen one of the films and you want to see them. But it's just a great experience reading this book. Highly recommend it. Without further ado, let me bring Ted out now.
Just happy
Ted
to be
Perkins.
here, John. It's always nice to be with you.
Yeah. So anyway, I love your book. I think it's unique. You know, I love film as well, and I love movies about recovery, and we've done some podcasts about some of those. But I've never read a book quite like this before, where you not only just talk about the movies and the films and the history behind them, but you weave into that the story of addiction and all the complexities of addiction, telling that through these films. And not only that, but you have a personal experience and connection to these films that kind of inspired you. And I'm hoping that maybe you can just kind of start by giving us a little bit of background about yourself, how you got interested in film, and what inspired you to write this book.
Well, I've been around film for my whole life. Growing up, I grew up overseas, and one of the great things about, and my father and mother were in the Foreign Service, and one of the great things about the Foreign Service was that anywhere you go, you have access to all of the movies made by all of the studios, thanks to the Armed Forces Radio and Television Network. So literally from the time I was 5 or 6 or whatever to the time I was 14 and went to high school in the States, I saw every movie that was ever made by the studios in any given year. So every Saturday, my sister and I would watch, American movies. And so I love them. I love movies. And I always liked creativity as well. So after I graduated high school and got my graduate degree, I moved to California, and I started working in the film industry, and just moved up the ladder, and I was very fortunate to be like one of the youngest studio executives in international over at Universal Pictures and Warner Brothers, and had sort of like a bird's eye view of the goings on at very high levels, and worked with movie stars and big producers, and worked on big marketing campaigns for big movies, and learned a lot. And in the course of going through a career like that, obviously alcohol and going to parties was a huge part of the job, and and still is. You really can't work in the movie business if you don't party. And if you and in fact, one of my jobs as a studio executive was to take clients out for dinner and drinks. And every time we went to the Cannes Film Festival, I would pick up these $1,000 tabs with after all these movie stars would be drinking at the Cap Hotel and the Martinez, etc. So it was just a big part of it. And then when I started working as a screenwriter and a producer, those industries are very cyclical. Like you're up, you're down, you're waiting, you're working really hard, and then you're waiting for other things to happen. And so, unfortunately, I started using alcohol badly, and sort of like to pass the time. And then it became a problem. And then I dealt with the problem successfully by turning to smart recovery and doing my own work. And then also, I decided like maybe these movies about drugs and alcohol and recovery have something interesting to say about it. And so I sort of barricaded myself in my room with an iTunes account and watched 100 movies in 100 days. Um, and it actually probably I ended up probably watching more movies, but I started to see patterns, and I started to see that movies are really very interesting vehicles to tell some very profound things about not just addiction, but the story of people overcoming addiction, and some of the heroic efforts that people go to, and some of the sad endings and some of the heroic endings. And so I thought there was something really cool there.
And is it true that Hollywood was doing does a little bit of a delicate dance around this, that addiction might not be the topic that they really want to cover, and that certain like you were writing about one of the actors, I think Jack Lemmon, who was known as a comedic actor, might not want to be shown in a movie where he's an alcoholic, But so there's a lot of that interesting stuff behind the scenes there. Uh,
Well, the issue with that is that, as I mentioned in the book, and especially in the introduction, it's kind of a miracle that these movies about addiction recovery exist at all, because it was a very touchy subject, and it's kind of a Debbie Downer topic. And so for movies like The Lost Weekend to come out, and for movies like, Days of Wine and Roses to come out, there were really big risks. And, directors like Billy Wilder really had to fight with the studios to make these kinds of movies. And Blake Edwards, who did Days of Wine and Roses, he really, really had to fight with the studio to get his vision across, because they had a very compelling reason to make these movies, and they had something very important to say, and they wanted people to know that these were issues and problems that should be talked about. Because alcoholism and drug abuse were these things that sort of happened in the shadows, and they were swept under the rug. And so for mainstream audiences to see that was, in a sense, it was a public service, but it was also a great story. So it accomplished both aims. And the actors who were in these films took huge risks, like Ray Milland, who starred in The Lost Weekend. Everybody told him, from his agent to his managers to even the studio executives, said, this is going to kill your career. Don't do this movie. You're nuts. But something inside him said, you know what, this is really important, and it paid off. He won multiple Oscars, and he went on to a huge career. Jack Lemmon's career was only bolstered by by his performance in Days of Wine and Roses. When look at what happened to Nicolas Cage when he took a risk, and he could very easily be making $10 million a movie doing The Rock and all these big action movies, but he did Leaving Las Vegas playing a crazy drunk, and he won the Academy Award. And even people like Angelina Jolie, who her first huge breakout role was in Geo, where she
I
plays
never
a
knew that, and
heroin
I've
addict.
never seen that movie. I have got to watch that.
Oh, it's one. I mean, if like I said in the book, if you like full frontal nudity, people doing drugs at 54, and a killer '80s soundtrack, and reckless disregard for all common sense, that's a perfect movie for you. And it's on HBO, so if you have an HBO now, then you can see the movie for free.
So you started the book with the first movie that you wrote about was The Lost Weekend. And I guess that is probably one of the better known historically of the films about addiction. I don't know if it was the first or not, but why did you choose to focus on that one?
Well, it really is the seminal moment for movies about addiction and recovery and alcohol. It really was the first studio movie to actually go there, to that place. Nobody really knew what alcoholism was. I mean, the term had only been coined, a couple of years earlier. Alcoholics Anonymous and the whole idea that alcohol use could be a problem, a pathology, was very little known. It was sort of like, your Uncle Bob has a problem and he can't go to work, and, he needs to go to the hospital. He's not feeling well. Those are the ways that you would talk about alcoholism back in the day. And so this movie sort of brought it out and showed that, anybody can get into that sort of problem. And the film is very unique in the sense that even though it was done, 70, 80 years ago, it still is super resonant today. I mean, if you watch the movie now, and I watch the movie every month, and I always see something new in it. It really touches on everything from enabling to the lies that people tell themselves to finding meaning in life, the lack of meaning in life, to the issues of whether you drink to forget your problems or whether your problems are caused because you drink. It's the chicken or the egg conundrum. How you move forward once you decide that you don't want to, engage in alcohol anymore. It's a very profound film. It touches on so many aspects of addiction recovery. I thought it was very important to put it first.
Yeah. And then you also wrote about the film Leaving Las Vegas, which was interesting in that that movie didn't have a happy ending, right? So,
Well, and that's part of the wonder. And I tell this story in the book is that Lila Kazez, who was the producer of the movie, she had Nicolas Cage and she had this great screenplay and she shopped it around to all the studios and the studios met with her and said, we like it. It's really interesting. I think it's super topical, but he dies at
he
the end.
does.
Can you like change it so that he goes to rehab and then he hooks up with Elizabeth Shue and they live in the suburbs and she becomes a social worker and they have kids and they live happily ever after. And Lila Kazez just laughed them out of the room because, the point of the movie, the bigger point of the movie is to show that recovery is not guaranteed. Successful recovery is really sometimes the exception to the rule, and we have to sort of be aware of that, and also understand that some people are just not at a place where they're going to seek help, and that's tragic. But we can all learn from that. It also has some very important things I think to say about the question of suicide and finding meaning, and I talk about Viktor Frankl's book Man's Search for Meaning, and Albert Camus and the myth of Sisyphus. I mean, there's a lot of deep philosophical insights in that film that come out if you're looking for them. And it's also, interesting enough, it's kind of a train wreck of a movie, and a lot of people when they see the film, they're shocked by Nicolas Cage going down that rabbit hole. But it's sort of like a wreck on the 405 freeway. Like you say, it's really you don't want to look, but you have to look. And sometimes it's good that you look because it reminds you that that could be you. You're just a couple levels removed from that sort of behavior, and you don't want to end up like Nicolas Cage. Although it would be nice to win an Oscar, but you know what I mean.
Right, right. And you also wrote about movies that were kind of like just called them cautionary tales. And the one that you wrote about that I'm familiar with the most, that became kind of a joke, was Reefer Madness.
Yeah. Here's a funny thing. The whole story of Reefer Madness is sort of like a whole book in and of itself. The film was it was funded by a Christian organization, and then it really played into the Henry Anslinger, the original war on drugs with the Harrison Narcotic Act of the 30s, and back then, really they really wanted to deflect criticism away for the fact that they weren't going after the real public enemy number one, which was organized crime, and so they came up with the boogeyman, which was the dope fiend. But really, what it was a thinly veiled and not too thinly veiled and quite obvious way to stigmatize Black people and Asians and Latinos and make it seem like they were the perpetrators. And really, what when you look back at historically, this was a way to vilify people, and the fact that, like, well, people are going to smoke dope and they're going to forget their place in social hierarchies and racial hierarchies. And so it was a very racist film. And also the funny thing about the film is it's just so utterly horrible. And so it became the butt of jokes, in midnight movie circuits. In fact, Robert Shea, who was the founder of New Line Cinema, picked up a copy of the film and made copies because they had screwed up the copyright registration. And so he could exploit it. He made so much money on that film that he eventually ended up founding New Line Cinema. And the whole reason that we're looking at films like, the Lord of the Rings trilogy and all of the great New Line cinema movies is because of Reefer Madness. That's how he got his start. That's how New Line got its start. It's a funny story, but and I used to get really stoned and go watch the movie with my friends in Georgetown theaters at midnight madness showings back when I was in high school, and we used to laugh our asses off. But when I realize it now, there was really nothing funny about it. It was really the first salvo in what became this very tragic and $1 trillion waste of time and energy, which became the war on drugs, which had very sad endings for everybody, especially Black and Brown communities.
Yeah. So I'm just kind of going through these in order. I don't know if that's the best way of doing it, but now I'm looking at Gia, and Gia is the film. Do I remember right that that's actually based on a real character? That
Yeah,
Gia,
yeah.
yes,
Gia Karanji. What I found compelling about this is that it's not so much a story about a young girl who you know becomes addicted to heroin and then slowly tries really hard to get off it, but then slowly ends up digging her own grave and then eventually dying of intravenous drug use, AIDS complications derived from intravenous drug use. But the story of Gia is really a bigger story about how people, even at the top of their game, the most successful people, I mean, she had it all. She had, like, she's making $1 million a minute. She's being flown to photo shoots all over the world. I mean, by any metric, anybody would want to have her life. And yet she was a heroin addict and that destroyed her career. And so it's cautionary in the sense that, like, addiction really does not discriminate. And it has something very interesting to say about the fact that, you can be very successful and sometimes fame and fortune is a burden that creates sort of existential ennui that you need to use drugs and alcohol to overcome it. And we see this in popular culture now, when Demi Lovato and all of these movie stars and music stars who are in rehab. Matthew, the guy from Friends, just had this huge news release and just released a book about it. It touches every life, and in fact, sometimes the pressures of being, of fame and fortune are such that they medicate more than others. In fact, as we know, sometimes doctors, the most successful lawyers and doctors also self-medicate because of the stresses of being that successful. And it also tells you something about the fact that no matter how much you have and how successful you are, you're still, stuck with yourself and your own issues and your own problems. And none of those factors can get you out of a hole if you dig it for yourself. Nothing will get you out. You have to do the work yourself. You can't buy yourself out of it, and you can't publicize yourself out of it.
yeah. And look how many successful actors have actually become have alcohol and drug problems, and
More
so
than more than more than you know.
yeah,
More than you know.
yeah, I'm sure. I think my favorite part of the book, and maybe it was because I recently saw one of these films, Beautiful Boy, was when you were writing about the films, but also the relationships between the characters and the complexities and the problems of um, an addict and either their parent or their spouse. And I didn't see Four Good Days, but I saw Beautiful Boy, and that movie was just heart wrenching. What the father went through with trying to figure out what was going on with his son.
Mhm. Well, and and I felt that to be fully balanced and just instead of just showing the story of somebody using drugs and alcohol or some other maladaptive behavior, and then suffering the consequences, we have to realize that other people, friends and family members, suffer consequences as well, and they're sort of trapped in this in this conundrum. Whereas you want to help. Like, for instance, in the case of like a son or daughter, you want to help your son or daughter, but is it your fault that they've become addicted? Were you too strict? Woulda, coulda, shoulda. And so parents go through this sort of process of always trying to figure out, what did I do wrong, and then they extend it even further to say, well, what can I do now to help my son or daughter? And a lot of times the help they try to give is not always the help that they need. And so it's a very difficult situation. And so, as friends and family at Smart Recovery and other programs will tell you, you have to draw boundaries. And just like the father in David Schiff in Beautiful Boy had to eventually draw a boundary and say, I cannot help my son anymore. He's going to do what he's going to do. And I've lost control of this, and I didn't control it from the beginning. I can't control it now. All I can do is just hope that he makes the right decision. And yet, by doing that, cutting contact off with your son or daughter, you know that there's the risk that they may do more harm to themselves, be lonely, feel ostracized, feel ashamed that they don't have their father or mother's love anymore, and then, take a fentanyl overdose and die. And then the parent has to live with the consequences of that guilt of thinking, did I do enough? And so those are just heart-wrenching kinds of issues that people deal with every day. And so to see it in a movie like, Beautiful Boy, um, is really important because it really touches millions of lives. In fact, I did sort of like a back of the napkin calculation that, like, if 10% of the United States is addicted in some way, shape, or form to alcohol or drugs, and then each of these people know five people in terms of close relationships, with which is the average, you've got 500 million people potentially affected by drug or alcohol use of a friend or loved one or colleague. And that's a huge number. And everybody wants to do the right thing, but sometimes doing something is not the right approach. And I talk a lot about the whole myth of codependency, that parents of addicted sons or daughters feel that they have a problem, they need therapy, they have a disease. And a lot of this stuff is very is not proven and really sort of counterproductive. And I also wanted to tell the story of, like, relationships of alcohol. Like Days of Wine and Roses is a classic. I call it a menage a trois with addiction, where two people, like, who fall in love because of their alcohol use suddenly realize that when they quit drinking, they're not the same relationship. It's not the same love affair. Or you look at a film like When a Man Loves a Woman, where this a marriage is torn apart by the fact that one of the people has an alcohol problem and goes to rehab, and when they emerge, they're a completely different person. And that's something that says something about the nature of love and the nature of relationships built on alcohol and drugs. And sadly, there are a lot of relationships are based on alcohol and drugs.
Of all the movies that I've seen about addiction and recovery, I thought that When a Man Loves a Woman was the most realistic when it came to showing what a recovering person is like. When she was going through that phase of figuring out who she was, and how he could no longer recognize his wife, and that relationship was changing. I just thought that was just so amazingly well done. I love that movie. It's really a good one.
It was, and it was made by Louis Mandoki, who actually is a friend of mine, and I was working with him to try to get some of his films set up at Universal. He's a very lyrical storyteller. He's a very underrated, sometimes forgotten artist, who is very unique in the sense that he was one of the first Mexican auteur cinema filmmakers to make it in the Hollywood studio system, and he sort of paved the way for others to follow, like González Iñárritu and Alfonso Cuarón and Guillermo del Toro, all these big names from Mexico cinema. He was really a trailblazer, and a very lyrical, beautiful storyteller who really told a very important story about not just recovery, but the story of what happens after recovery. I think it was Gene Siskel who said, it's not so much a movie about recovery; it's a story about a person's recovery from a spouse's recovery. In a sense, it has very many, it has a lot of layers to it. And it's something that I personally relate to as well because of my own life, and other people relate to quite. You don't really have to be in or out or be in recovery or not to really understand what happens in that film. Is that sometimes your relationship, the foundation, the premise of your relationship changes, and you have to fall in love all over again, if that's even possible.
Right. I also thought it was interesting going back to Beautiful Boy and the other film, Four Good Days, that you wrote about this idea of tough love, and I remember that being like the thing when I was first getting sober. But you're not so much a proponent of that, are you? And that decision that they made, that the father made in the movie Beautiful Boy, that wasn't tough love either. That boundary that he drew, was it?
Yeah, it's a very gray area, but unfortunately, because of the severity of the problem, and a book that was published, several years back, which I discussed in the book, which is Codependent No More, which was a huge hit. But unfortunately, that caused a lot of damage in the sense that, like, it created this idea that you're codependent if you're taking care of a spouse or loved one or a family member with addiction. And the idea of tough love is sort of, it can be picked apart on many many different levels. Like, So tough love would tell you, the proponents of classic tough love would tell you that, if your son or daughter has, an issue with alcohol or drugs, you should call the police. They should hit rock bottom. You should make sure that you kick them out of the house, make sure that they're homeless, make sure that they turn to prostitution. That'll teach them. That's the only way to teach them. That's the only way to fix them, is to make sure that they feel the pain. But we all know that that actually is entirely wrong. At the time it might seem fine, but when that was created, that was during the time when, Reagan era, three strikes you're out, mandatory minimum drug sentencing, the whole idea that like punishment is the only way. But now, as a society, we're much more enlightened, and we realize now that tough love is actually a really bad idea, and it's been scientifically proven that to not work at all. It's actually counterproductive. And a lot of treatment facilities that have advocated tough love and forced parents to disengage from their children who are in rehab, and then went on to commit suicide or have fentanyl or other heroin overdoses. Those parents have now sued the facilities for giving them really, really bad advice to disengage and practice tough love when their kids were like this close to, to coming around. And that's really unfortunate. And then tough love also is gray in the sense that, like, well, how tough can it be? Are there mitigating circumstances? And, if your son or daughter is a heroin addict, but they started because they had back pain and they started taking pain pills, but then they got addicted to the pain pills. And then the only alternative that they had was that they ran out of the pain pill medications and couldn't get prescriptions. And the cheapest thing to deal with their pain was heroin. And then that was their only recourse. And they're so afraid of going through rehab, going through withdrawals because of the sickness involved, that they'll do anything to get the money. They'll even like liquidate their parents' 401k. Yes, that's horrible, but they're operating under the premise that they're sick and they need help. And so giving them help is somewhat is justified. Whereas, society looks at somebody who's a heroin addict as like, oh, they made a choice to become a heroin addict. That's just a bad decision. They like partying, they like heroin. You know what they could have done? They could have gotten a job, they could have done anything. And a lot of times that's true. There are a lot of bad agents who are simply heroin addicts or drug addicts because they made bad decisions and now they're hooked. But we have to divorce, the moral sentiments that we might have about drug addicts and alcoholics, or to call them alcoholics. We have to sort of like bifurcate that and say there are reasons why people use drugs and alcohol, and not all of them are personal choices. Yes, they're personal choices because they choose to, but there are a lot of mitigating circumstances: past abuse, genetics, something, trauma, PTSD, and a lot of these things are very situational. You lose your job, or COVID hits and you're stuck at home and you start drinking more than usual. Next thing you know, 6 months later, you're hooked. So, is that a bad person?
No, and speaking of reasons why people will use, you also wrote about a film I have not seen about Purdue Pharma and how they pushed Oxycontin out on the population. And that is so interesting. I need to see that. I need to see that film. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a series on Hulu called Dope Sick. And what's unique about it is that, there are several books about it, and there was a documentary on HBO. But what I wanted to do was sort of like go look at the storylines of that series, and sort of, what does it have to say about all the interlocking pieces of that whole, addiction epidemic? All the bad agents. And there's so many parties involved. It's sort of like an epic novel with several storylines that are interwoven. It's almost like a James Joyce novel in its complexity, or a Faulkner novel, in the sense that, like, you've got these West Virginia coal miners who need pain medication because they have to go to work even though they're injured themselves and they don't have any paid leave or sick days. And then you have a doctor who should know better, but he really wants to help his clients. And then you have the people in the Purdue Pharma sales department who are getting these young Turks who want to make fast money right out of college, and they're given these incredible incentives to really push the drug. And they're in every doctor's office, like really pushing, giving away free samples. And then you've got Purdue Pharma, doing this marketing around, made up conditions like breakthrough pain. And then, them doing fake commercials using fake people saying, oh, it doesn't cause addiction at all. This is wonderful. And then you've got, Purdue Pharma paying these advocacy groups to look the other way, paying people from the FDA to approve special dispensations for approval of the drug that was clearly addictive. Skewing data sets and giving some really really bad samples to the FDA, where it's a classic case of lying with statistics. There's so many interlocking pieces of that, and doctors who realized that they could actually make money by prescribing, which created pill mills. So there were so many perverse incentives all through the value chain that it became this perfect storm. And it's told beautifully in the series. And it's difficult to do because, given the breadth of that story, to condense that down into a mini series, or 10 episodes is very, very challenging. As a screenwriter, and I write TV, in fact, I have a TV series in development right now, and I've sold several TV scripts. It's not easy to do. It's a lot of work to really put all that information in a way that's going to be compelling and entertaining and engaging, and something that's going to hold people's attention, because there's so much information. And yet they really did a wonderful job in pulling that off in a series. It's very important to see. Um,
And so all these films that we've talked about so far are dealt with alcohol and drugs, but you also wrote about other addictions that you called micro addictions. And I think the one that I found the most interesting that you wrote about was sex addiction. And the reason I found that so interesting, I'm not real sure if I know your stance on this, if whether it's an addiction or not. But it was really interesting to read the different ways you can look at it. Like you can look at it as, you know, society just sees sex. Society puts judgments on sex that they shouldn't. You talk about John Waters' movie where he's just kind of outrageous out there, And I wonder if you could talk about how you feel about the idea of sex addiction and what you were trying to say with the films that you chose to wrote about on that subject.
Yes. Well, sex addiction is a micro addiction. It's like any other addiction. It's a feedback loop, and it's actually one of the most powerful feedback loops. It's actually the first and only feedback loop that makes any sense. I mean, we have three mandates in life. One is to wake up and eat, and the other one is to have sex, and then we can go home. And we've done what we're supposed to be doing in humanity. And so, given that, it's there's something really funny about the sense, like, to be addicted to sex and want to have sex all the time is actually, from a genetic point of view, from the point of view of like Richard Dawkins and the selfish gene, that's a home run.
That's how
Like,
we were
that
designed.
is what we should. That's the reason there's so many people in the world, and why we're so tremendously successful as a species, and why evolution works, because of the urge to procreate more than usual. But what is usual? Who defines what too much
Right,
sex
right.
is? So, and also, and what is an aberrant, what is sex addiction? A lot of people think that it's like, addicted to sex means, you're addicted to masturbation and you're hiring prostitutes and you have like bad sex and illicit sex, or sex with animals, or gay sex, or, and you know what? Those are all expressions of sexual things. There are things called paraphilia, which are explored in this John Waters movie, A Dirty Shame. But he does it in the sense that, like, these are people that are just following their bliss. They're not hurting anybody. They just happen to like different kinds of sex. And yet, as a society, and of course, since Christians and Catholic, anybody with a religious background hates John Waters' movie, because he's like a lightning rod for controversy when it comes to that. I love him. I had drinks with him at the first class lounge at JFK several times. He's a good friend of mine. But the issue is that, if we're judging sex at what it should be, then we're really setting ourselves up into a trap, and we realize that everybody's putting uh, their own uh, their own biases and their own judgments into an analysis of what is a purely private concern, which is how you want to have sex. And yet, by the same token, when you see a movie like Shame, and you see Michael Fassbender, who clearly has a problem. It's clearly suffering, clearly it's screwing up his relationships. It's making it impossible for him to have a normal, healthy relationship with a woman. Um, we realize that, yes, this is a pathology. It causes harm. It breaks up marriages. It causes turmoil. It erodes trust. It causes diseases. It causes death sometimes. And so, yes, it's a serious thing, but by the same token, you could look at sex addiction as like the Tiger Woods defense,
Right.
in many
Right.
respects. Like it's a very easy thing to sort of pull out of the woodwork if you happen to be somebody who cheats. And let's face it, a lot of people, not just men, a lot of people cheat.
Right.
Are they sex addicts? No, they're just following their bliss. Yes, they happen to be married. Not a good thing. Breaks up their marriages. But are they addicts? Like,
Right.
do they need help? Do they need rehab? I mean, I don't know. those are questions that I thought were worth exploring in the book. And I don't have answers to a lot of these questions. Really, what I do is I use films as a way to pose the questions. And then I really invite the person who reads the book to think about those questions as they relate to their own lives and their own issues.
And I did. I found that fascinating. I thought it was a really interesting discussion. You wrote about the genetics behind it and how we evolved as creatures and the different ways of looking at sex and how it has been looked at historically. I just found it really, really interesting.
Well,
So,
thanks. Yeah, I thought it was interesting to also talk about the history of sex in Hollywood
yeah,
because it had, when most people don't realize that the first films were pornographic films, peep shows.
that's right.
Were all, so really, again, a new technology owes its success to sex, just like what sex did for the internet.
Right.
It did for movies. And
Yep.
so, and then, the Hays Code and et cetera. And so sex in movies has waned and gone up and down. And there used to be so much sex in movies, and now there isn't hardly any sex in movies. And I explain why that happened as well.
Yeah. And you wrote about food addiction too. Was that your first addiction? Did you have an issue with that?
Yeah, I was the first kid to hit 100 pounds when I was a kid. And
Oh, that's right.
a lot of my friends probably were about to hit 100 pounds anyway, but I was the first, and so they taunted me. And ever since then, I had like this dysfunctional relationship with food. And I kind of still do, and a lot
Yeah,
of people, and I realize a lot of people do.
sure.
I eat right, I exercise and everything, but I'm like a lot of people, like most people, like I always think about what I eat, and it's kind of a drag, to always be thinking and worrying and like, oh no, I shouldn't eat that, and okay, I can allow myself to have this dessert this one time. It's just a lot of mental
Yeah,
energy.
you look great though.
Yes. And it's a lot of work that's very much like being addicted to alcohol or drugs,
Yeah,
because when you're addicted to drugs, you're always planning
yeah,
when you can drink or when you can use and whether you should get away with it or not. And like, maybe I shouldn't, maybe I can. And so it's very much, food is an addiction that many people have, and they have a dysfunctional, it's not an addiction per se, but they have a dysfunctional relationship with
right,
food. And
right,
so I wanted to talk about that by using a movie about that, called Fatso, which was made by um, Mrs. Robinson herself. God, I'm blanking on her name, but Mel Brooks's wife,
right.
who made a wonderful movie about it. It's a terrible movie. It's not one that I recommend that you see. Just read the book instead of
Okay.
watching the movie. But the movie has some very profound, very prescient things to say. It was made like 50 years ago, but it touches on everything from like what dieting ended up becoming. It forecasted the Atkins revolution.
Wow.
It forecasted the keto diet. It has a lot of very interesting things to say about acceptance and things like that. And also, how Hollywood has dealt with the issue of obesity and how it's used fat comics and fat actors to make money. And at the same time, but it's okay to use fat actors and actresses to make money because they're funny, like Chris Farley and John Belushi. It's funny on one level, but then they end up dying because of it as well. So it's sort of like a double-edged sword. Fat is funny in some contexts, but it's not funny in others. And there's a very fine line, and a lot of people tread that line, and it's very dicey. It's a very complicated subject, and I thought it was very important to talk about it in a much more open way. And that's why I think talking about it in the context of movies is a very sort of cleansing way to talk about a very difficult, thorny problem that millions of people suffer from in one way or another, and to various degrees.
Oh, I love it. People are going to read this book and they're going to learn about addiction, but you're going to want to see these films too. I want to see a lot of these films, and some of these films I've seen that I want to see again and think about them after I have read this book. Now, the last section of movies that you wrote about had to deal with recovery, and I happen to have seen every single one of these, and I thought they were great. And so, Clean and Sober, that movie is really special to me because it came out the year I got sober, and as you wrote, he also made Beetlejuice the same year.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's he's a very interesting actor in the sense that like he could really, he got cast as Batman,
Yeah.
and he could write his ticket, do any movie that he wanted. Yet he chose to make a movie that was, very controversial at the time. Nobody had ever made a movie about inpatient rehab. It was the first movie of its kind, and it was a brave value proposition, and everybody behind it took a big risk, and Michael Keaton took a big risk, and it paid off. I mean, he got a lot of attention from it. He didn't win any Academy Awards, I don't think, but he did get like the film critics mention and award for his portrayal. But it was really the first time that you could see that Michael Keaton was a serious actor, because here he was typecast as like, I'm Batman and I'm Beetlejuice and he's all these things. And yet now we know that he is way much more than just those things. He has blossomed as an actor who's winning Academy Awards, and won the Emmys for Dope Sick. He's a real person, and that's another example of an actor who took a big risk.
Mm.
And he probably didn't get paid anything. He probably got paid scale to do the movie, because it was pretty relatively low budget movie, but it paid off for him in the sense that, like, it takes courage to do those kinds of roles and to play an addict who nobody really likes. He's a coke addict, and he helps somebody OD, and he could care less, and he's trying to phone it in at rehab, and he doesn't take it seriously. And then eventually over time, he comes to accept that fact, and then he succeeds in recovery, which is a great, rags to riches hero overcoming adversity story. And in the sense, it mirrors, the story of Michael Keaton in real life. Typecast actor, really, really bad job decisions, low ebbs in his career, and then resurrecting himself Phoenix-like from the ashes of a failed career to now be, being paid $20 million a movie.
He's one of my favorite actors. I've never seen any of the Batman movies, but he's one of my favorite. But the thing about that, I hate to make this about me, but damn it, that movie.
I want people to make it about
that movie in 1988. I was feeling everything that he felt. And I have never in my life had that experience watching a movie and relating to the characters so well. And what was so funny, Beetlejuice was playing at another theater, right? And it was playing at the Dollar Theater. I saw that movie more than any other movie ever in my life. And what I would do, because I had no job, I needed to escape. So I would give him $1. I'd watch the movie. The movie would end. I'd go back out. I'd go back in, give him $1. I'd watch it repeatedly. And it was like a great escape. So I have on one hand, Michael Keaton giving me the reality of addiction and recovery and me feeling it to my gut. And then on the other hand, he was helping me escape from all the bullshit too. So anyway.
Life is nothing but mysterious. I mean, it's very ironic. And that's what I try to convey in the book, is that, like, the story of addiction, recovery, and life in general is very complex. It's as complex and nuanced as movies are.
Yeah. And then you also wrote about, oh gosh, we're okay. In these recovery films. Okay. The one I didn't see was Recovery Boys, but I did see 28 Days and Thanks for Sharing. I liked Thanks for Sharing. I thought that was a really good film about the relationships of people in recovery.
I wanted to end the book with that movie particularly, because I had never seen it. At the time, it was marketed as a movie about sex addicts, and that was sort of like, it was the first time that they really wanted to market it. But they sort of lost their nerve, and the movie came out, and it had this huge cast and big production values and beautiful look and feel and everything, but it sort of didn't really go anywhere. And I hadn't seen it, but when I saw it, and then I saw it again, and I watched it the third time, I realized that it is actually like, if you know about addiction recovery and you're in recovery, it is actually one of the most profound and important movies made about recovery, of all the movies that I had seen. I think it's a very important film because it touches on the issue of family and friends. It touches on the issue of like what recovery looks like, what 12-step looks like, what other modalities of recovery look like. It looks at not just sex addiction, but the idea of being addicted and looking for help and finding solutions. So it's sex addiction, alcohol addiction, drug addiction. And also it has some very profound things to say about the nature of forgiveness and how to atone for past sins and how you deal with somebody who has an alcohol problem. I mean, let's face it, a lot of people in the world are married to people who are, who are in recovery and have been in recovery for, many years, and everything seems fine. But anybody who's the spouse of somebody in recovery knows that all it takes is a flick of a switch. There's no such thing as sobriety for life. There's always the non-zero possibility that somebody might relapse, and it does happen. I know people I know a guy in the park who's a meth addict right now, who was a pillar in his community, and he was in AA and smart recovery for many, many years, and a pillar of his community, and went and took counseling courses and became a counselor. And for some stupid, odd reason that he still doesn't understand, he decided to have a couple of drinks at a bar one night for no reason at all. He wasn't even stressed out. He just thought, I can do it. And cut to 6 months later, he's living in a park and he's lost everything. There's always the possibility of that happening. And people live with that constant threat. It's sort of like this looming threat of imminent disaster that hangs over everybody who's in a relationship with somebody who has a substance or alcohol use disorder. And so, all you can do is just take care of yourself, be vigilant, and put systems in place to love but verify. And those are very profound things to say in a movie. And it's just chock full. I really highly recommend it. It's also very
I
entertaining.
Yes.
And
Good
Gwyneth
music in there
Paltrow,
too, I thought.
yeah, and Gwyneth Paltrow is astounding, and Mark Ruffalo, who I sometimes find milk toast, does a great job, and Pink,
Yeah, she was good.
the singer, she steals the movie, and then Josh Gad, who went on to be Olaf, he's hysterical. There's just something for everybody in that movie, and it's a very important film to see for anybody in recovery, I think.
So just to wind things up, so I signed up for something that is related to this book. So you're going to tell me about this. I'm going to be getting a newsletter once a month, I think. And
The Addicted in Film Movie Club. I wrote the book, but I also want to keep the conversation going, and so and there's all these other movies that I couldn't fit into the book. My editor finally said, "Stop writing, Ted. You don't want a book to be this big. You're done. You reached like 90,000 words. Let's make it for the next book." I was like, okay. So there's all these other films that I wanted to talk about, that I still want to talk about. So, if you go to my website, www.addictedinfilm.com, you can sign up for the Addicted in Film Movie Club, and it's free. And you just sign up, and then it puts you on our email list. And then every month I'm going to send out an email, like a newsletter. It's going to have like a review of a new movie about addiction and recovery, and then some video and some podcasts and some other rich media content, and invitations for people to join in what I call watch party movie nights.
I love it.
Yeah, Amazon has these things called watch parties. So what you can do is, for the first 100 people, once you reserve, after the invitation goes out, you can all watch the same movie at the same time. And then there's a Zoom call right afterwards. And then we hop on the Zoom and we just talk about the movie and sort of chat to see like what did you get out of it and what are your thoughts. And I also want to like engage with the community. It's like, what kind of movies spoke to you? Because I don't, sometimes people will send me like, hey, did you cover this movie? And I'm like, I've never heard of it. Wow, it sounds great. I'm open to hearing what people suggest, and by engaging with the community through the movie club, I hope that all of us can have like a deeper understanding of all the movies and that have interesting things to say about addiction recovery that can help us all in our own recovery journey, or just keep us entertained and happy and talking about something that a problem that a lot of people would like to solve in some way, shape, or form. And if movies is a part of that, then my job is done.
I'm looking forward to that. So I'm going to put links out when we post this podcast and video. There'll be links to your website where you can find the book, where you can join that club, and any other information that you would want us to put out there where people can contact you and learn more about you.
Thank you. Yeah. Also, the audiobook version is coming out in a week. So, if you prefer to listen to the audiobook, I narrated it. And so there's a lot of, as you read the book, you realize there's a lot of like snarky, sarcastic, funny anecdotes and funny stories about my crazy time in Hollywood. I mean, it was a crazy ride. And And I like to relay those stories, in my own voice. So I hope people really enjoy that part of it. I mean, partly it's about recovery and addiction, but there's some really funny stories in there that I think people will find kind of amusing.
Well, you did a great job. Thank you so much for writing the book and for coming on this podcast to talk about it. It was really nice of you to take the time to do that, and I really appreciate it.
Oh no, thanks, John. You keep up the great work. I love your initiative. I love your website, your community, your podcasts, and everything that you're doing. I think it's wonderful. So keep up the great work, and thank you for having me.